Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Dimitris Xygalatas. He is Associate Professor in Anthropology and Psychological Sciences and Head of the Experimental Anthropology Lab at the University of Connecticut. His interests include ritual, sports, cooperation, the interaction between cognition and culture, and the impact of cultural practices on psychophysiological well-being. And today we're going to focus on his book, Ritual: How Seemingly Senseless Acts Make Life Worth Living. So, Dr. Xygalatas, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hi, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, let's start perhaps with a definition. So, from the perspective of anthropology, what is a ritual?
Right. So, of course, in the anthropological record, you can find many particular definitions of ritual, but for our purposes, I think what we can consider ritual, and according to the definition that is in my book, rituals are those sequences of actions that must be repeated precisely, and yet either have no explicit goal, or even when they do, there's no connection, causal connection between this goal and the means by which we try to achieve that. So to state that in plain English, if I use a toothbrush to brush my teeth every morning, this is not a ritual because it has an explicit goal and there's a causal connection between the means and the outcomes. But if I were to wave my toothbrush in the air 3 times every morning with the belief that it cleanses my teeth, or with no belief at all, just because I have to do this every morning, now that would be exactly my definition of a ritual.
But the disconnect here between means and goals, I mean, is it that people who practice the rituals are aware of this disconnect, or is that just something that scientists find?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And there is, in fact, evidence in the anthropological record that people do make this distinction. People might believe that their rituals act on the world, but even when they do, they have an understanding that this is a fundamentally different kind of action. This is not the same action as in physical causation. So a famous example in anthropology comes from Evans Pritchard, who went around asking his informants, why did a granary collapse? So this granary collapsed and people were sitting underneath it, died. And at first people said this is the result of witchcraft. And upon further probing, he said, well, what about the termites? And they said, of course, we know that termites can eat the wood, and this is why the granary collapsed. But then again, why did the granary collapse? So there's always sort of some kind of ultimate explanation. And this is the type of explanation I think that rituals address. I think at least the supernatural types of rituals. So when people perform this, any kind of fertility ritual, for example, to help their crops grow, they do not stop tending to their crops. They keep doing all the manual labor that is required, but they also perform those rituals. So this is all evidence that people do make this fundamental distinction between rituals and other kinds of causations. Having said that, we still do see that people do have intuitive expectations that rituals actually do things in the world. For example, we did a study in my lab where we showed people basketball players shooting free throws, and in half of the time they would see those rituals that basketball players often perform before shooting a free throw. So spinning of the ball, kissing the ball, tapping on the ball, things like that. And we didn't say anything about ritual there. We just showed them each shot, and we stopped the video before, right after the ball left their hands, and we asked them to predict the outcome of the shot. And it turns out people, when they saw the ritualized version of the shot, and it was always the same shot between conditions, they expected it to be more successful.
So I imagine that rituals would have some features in common with other kinds of human behaviors and activities. What is, for example, the difference between rituals and habits?
Right, that's another great question. And I think we can all intuitively feel this difference. And difference, it's a difference that has to do with what is special and meaningful. So for me, habits are ways of taking something directly utilitarian and functional, like brushing your teeth, for example, and turning it into something habitual so that you don't have to think about it. Rituals, on the other hand, may take something ordinary and turn it into something extraordinary, something deeply meaningful. So it is this sense of something that is demarcated as special, as particularly meaningful, and of course that is detached from its goals as an action.
How common are rituals in human societies? Do we find them across all societies? Are there, for example, any contexts where they are more common than others? How does it work exactly?
Absolutely. We find them in every human society, whether past or present. There's definitely no human culture that we've known that didn't have any rituals, and they pervade all aspects of our lives. Even in the most secular societies of today, we find them in all kinds of contexts. They don't just have to be confined to religious settings. We find them in our courtrooms, in our universities, in our everyday life, in our holiday traditions, in our homes. Ritual is everywhere. Now, do we find it in some contexts over others? Yes, when we talk about individual rituals, for example, rituals that are spontaneously performed, the kinds of things that sometimes we might call superstitions. Of course, that's not a meaningful term for me, because superstitions are just whatever the dominant religious establishment rejects. But if they're ritualized, they're just as much rituals, right? But those types of rituals, the kinds of things that we see athletes perform, for example, during a game, or gamblers performing in the casino, we tend to see those things. They flare up in contexts that involve a lot of uncertainty. And this goes back to very old anthropological observations. Some of the earliest anthropologists noticed that people tend to engage in more ritualized behaviors. They perform more of their rituals when they're exposed to conditions of stress and uncertainty. This is something that my colleagues and I were actually able to test experimentally. So when we brought people into the lab and we stressed them up, we saw that their behavior became more ritualized. And what do we mean by that? Well, we looked at some of the structural properties of ritual. What are most rituals like? Well, they involve repetition, and they involve long action sequences that are too repeated, so they're very rigid. They have to be done in a specific way. They go beyond the requirements of a specific action. So when we bring people into the lab and we stress them up, we see that their behaviors become more repetitive, more redundant. They clean obsessively, for example. They use the same hand movements again and again, so they become ritualized. And there are all kinds of other types of evidence out in the real world that show that when there's increased uncertainty and threats like environmental disasters, people engage in more and more rituals. They go to church more often. They perform whatever are their familiar cultural rituals more frequently.
Mm-hmm. So, are rituals something that we only find in human societies, or are there any other species that we know of that also has rituals, or at least ritualized behaviors in certain circumstances?
Yeah, no, of course, we're certainly not the only animal that performs ritual. Ritual is very widespread in the animal kingdom, and that also shows something about its potential utility. Of course, we're all familiar with the elaborate mating rituals of many birds, but we see it in mammals. We see it in marine mammals. Whales seem to engage in synchronized singing, and they have all kinds of other collective activities. Sometimes they even seem to have morning rituals. So they might surround a dead member and start swimming around that member of their group. We see ritual in all kinds of mammals. Elephants seem to have an understanding of death, presumably, because they perform these morning rituals. At least there's another way to describe them. When a member of their group dies, they might gather around the body and start trumpeting for hours, and eventually they will travel back to the site to visit the bones of those deceased members. And if it's an important member of the group, like a matriarch, so the female leader of that group, they will show particular distress. They show signs of distress, They go and touch the bones, they smell them, they caress them. We find ritual in chimps. Jane Goodall described a waterfall dance. So when chimps come across natural phenomena such as a waterfall or maybe thunder, they have these group displays that can only be described as dances. They even have, more recently, primatologists in West Africa have found, they recorded videos of chimps visiting specific trees. They seem to be, I mean, we can, if these were behaviors observed in humans, we would certainly call them sacred trees. They seem to play similar roles for them. They visit those trees and they drum on them, and they pile rocks either in front of them or inside those trees. And those are very similar behaviors to what people in many cultures do. So those cairns that we find that demarcate sacred places in so many human cultures. Mm-hmm. Now, having said all that, there's no other animal that engages in ritual so compulsively and so extensively as we do. We are definitely the most ritualized of all animals.
And perhaps also in terms of how elaborate and complex they can become, perhaps ours are the ones that are more complex.
Absolutely, because our rituals are shrouded in culture, and they are embedded with all of those symbolic markers, markers of membership, markers of tradition, and all kinds of other things that allow us to expand our social groups.
Mm-hmm. So what functions do rituals serve? And do these functions apply to all rituals, or is it that we have to look on a case-by-case basis to see which specific functions does each kind of ritual serve?
I think we can make a distinction between the individual level effects of rituals and the collective level effects of rituals.
Okay.
So we know that rituals do a lot of things for human groups. They help people boost social cohesion. They help them create social support networks. They do all of those things. But of course, in order for ritual to be attractive to them in the first place, it has to do some things for the individual. And we know that at the individual level, ritual might help us soothe our anxieties. It might help us enhance our sense of self-control. And it might also increase our well-being. So you couple those two things together, and then you can get from the small scale to the large scale and see that ritual continuously has utility for individuals and therefore their communities alike.
Mm-hmm. In order to best understand rituals, where they come from, how they develop, and how they change over time, are there aspects of our evolved psychology that apply here, or are they best understood through cultural evolution, for example?
They're best understood in terms of both, of course. Like pretty much everything else in human behavior, we are a psychosocial and a cultural being, of course. So it's very useful to look at those mental predispositions that make us so susceptible and so eager to engage in rituals. For example, we're excellent imitators. Mm-hmm. There are studies that compare human children to adult chimps. For example, when they're given a box and they have to use a sequence of actions to get a treat out of the box. And in one case, the box is opaque. You cannot see what's inside it. Mm-hmm. And both chimps and human children, they go through all of these actions and they get the treat. And then they show them a transparent box that's made of plexiglass. And that makes it clear that the first few actions, they're pointless. They don't do anything. When you're asked to put a stick inside this little hole and push it, there's a false ceiling, so you're not actually causing anything to happen. All you need to do is do the last action and retrieve the treat. Now the chimps cut to the chase. They have no use for all these non-functional actions. But human children, they imitate precisely. And this is something that has been replicated across cultures. So we are compulsive imitators, and especially as children. And this has important adaptive value. We are a hyper-social and a cultural species. So most of what we know about the world comes from social learning. And that does not necessarily mean instruction. Actually, traditionally, very little of our learning would have to come from explicit instruction. It comes through observation. So the best way for a child to be and to behave is by observing what adults around them are doing. So we are intuitive imitators, and that's just one of the features that really makes ritual so attractive to us and so natural for us to perform.
If I understand it correctly, rituals seem to be very tied to human institutions. So how important are rituals for the maintenance and longevity of institutions?
They're fundamentally important, and the best evidence for this comes from the fact that even in societies that are where secular and religious authorities are not one and the same, so in modern democracies, ritual is just as important. One example that might highlight this is the inauguration of President Obama some years back. So during that inauguration, of course, there's the whole inauguration ceremony is a very elaborate ritual, but one part of the ceremony is one particular ritual, which is the oath. Now, as with any ritual, the oath doesn't really do anything. The president has already been elected and is already in office. But when Obama was delivering the oath, the Supreme Court justice made a tiny error. So he mixed up the order of the words. The sentence that he uttered was identical. There was, in terms of its meaning, there was no difference. Obama at first stumbled and then eventually uttered the wrong version of the oath. Maybe one preposition was off. It was a tiny mistake that did not change at all the semantics of the sentence. Mm-hmm. And immediately after that, there was a big controversy. Legal scholars started arguing about whether he was the legitimate president. And at first, the White House dismissed that, but eventually, the next day, they called in the press and they had a second oath-taking ceremony behind closed doors, as they said, out of an abundance of caution. So all of our social institutions have all of these rituals embedded in them, and that is no accident. By having those rituals, they gain a sense of authority, they gain a sense of tradition, and they gain a sense of importance. So it's unthinkable that in any society you would have a new prime minister, a new president, or a new king without any elaborate ceremony.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the relationship between rituals and meaning, what is meaning in the context of anthropology, and how is it that rituals imbue our lives with it?
Right. So there are very lengthy philosophical discussions about the meaning of meaning, and it's best not to get into those. But when I use the term here, I mean very simply what the average person understands, which is the way we attribute value and significance to experiences. And I've talked to people around the world about their rituals, and again and again and again, I hear that in so many of those communities, for so many people, some of their rituals are the most meaningful thing in their lives. Not just their religious lives, but their lives overall. So that's a key characteristic of ritual. It demarcates things as special. It demarcates them as valuable, and by doing this, it makes them meaningful. And meaning is also connected to our psychological well-being. Fundamentally, we seek meaning in our life, and we do this through all of those activities that we find to be so valuable, and ritual is one of them.
Mm-hmm. Looking back in our evolutionary history, is it correct to say that rituals have become more complex over time, or not?
I don't know if they have become more complex, but they certainly go through a process of natural selection, mm-hmm. like many other things. Ideas too are subjected to these pressures. It's not exactly the same as genetic evolution, but there are evolutionary processes that filter out ideas in the sense that every day there will be thousands of new rituals that are created. Those who don't really improve the conditions or the efficiency of the groups that come up with them, they will be lost. So the ones that we see around us that are that are traditional rituals, they might have been around for centuries or even millennia, and they stick around because they serve their functions better. So that doesn't necessarily have to come through complexity, through being longer or more elaborate. Sometimes it can come through simplification, but in any case, what changes over time is this, that the rituals that are better serve human communities, they're the ones who tend to be preserved.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about the evolution of civilization, people tend to associate it very much with the development of agriculture and the urge for food. But in the book, at a certain point, you sort of present an hypothesis that ties the evolution of civilization not necessarily to food, but to rituals. So could you explain that?
Yes. So recent archaeological evidence suggests that perhaps everything we thought we knew about the origins of civilization might be wrong. We tend to think as agriculture being this seminal event that that helped people transition from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle into a sedentary lifestyle, and this in turn allowed for all of the kinds of benefits that we enjoy today. The benefits of social institutions and things like welfare and policing and protection and technology and science and all of that. But of course, if we think about what happened back then, what was the benefit to those early farmers who abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and engaged in permanent settlement? Now, evolution has no foresight, as we say. So it's impossible that these farmers changed their entire lifestyle and took huge costs, undertook huge costs in order to do that, so that we can enjoy those benefits 12,000 years later. What I mean by huge cost is that we know that hunter-gatherers, compared to early farmers, they lived a much healthier lifestyle. They enjoyed a more varied diet. They were more resilient to pathogens and all sorts of other threats. Not that they lived a perfect life, but they were able to get by estimates say that they would probably work something like 4 hours a day in order to meet their living requirements, as opposed to early farmers who engaged in backbreaking labor to produce a surplus, which at the end of the day, this surplus eventually all it did was create the need for leaders and for militaries who were needed to defend that surplus. It also resulted in rampant social inequality because a handful of powerful individuals used those militaries to monopolize access to that surplus. So we see, for example, that people are having way more children, but very few of them survive into adulthood. We see from evidence in their teeth and their bones that they suffered from tuberculosis and from all kinds of diseases because they lived in close proximity to each other and also, of course, with their animals. We see signs of contamination, fecal contamination in their drinking water supplies. Average height dropped by 10 centimeters, so 4 inches. And in fact, it wasn't until about 100 years ago that it rebounds to pre-agricultural levels. So this was a terrible, terrible way of life for those early adopters of agriculture. So why do it? Traditional wisdom would have it that it was for these kinds of benefits of organized living that people clustered together in order to start building the first large cities. So it was the material infrastructures that were the prime mover of civilization. But there's some more recent evidence, like what we find in Göbekli Tepe, that might flip that thinking the other way around. So it's possible that it was actually some more spiritual needs, and specifically the need to perform ritual that might have been the impetus for the establishment of the first societies. Now let's get more specific about this. Göbekli Tepe is this monumental megalithic structure that is found in present-day Turkey, close to the Syrian border. It is enormous. There are about 20 of those megalithic circles. Each one of them is, you can think of it as a gigantic hall supported by monolithic pillars, each one of which weighed about 20 tons. And those pillars were carved from a nearby quarry and then carried and installed there. So this must have taken years of labor by hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals cooperating together to build this site. Now, the most remarkable, and it's a very, very elaborate, very heavily decorated site. So there are all of these carvings and reliefs. And it was very clearly a ritual site of some sort. It's a temple. Mm-hmm. But the most astonishing thing about it is not its artwork and it's not its size or anything else. It's age. Mm-hmm. Göbekli Tepe, to our knowledge at this point, is the oldest monumental structure that we know of. It's twice as old as Stonehenge, over twice as old, and it's 3 times as old as the pyramids. It dates about 13,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that means that it was built by hunter-gatherers, by people who had not invented the wheel, had not invented writing or pottery, and had no permanent settlement. So people traveled long distances to cooperate in order to build the site together. And later, they would travel again to visit it, perhaps annually, we don't know. But evidence suggests that they would visit from as far away as Jordan and Israel. And it's only about 500 years later that we find the first evidence for the domestication of plants and animal in that area. Mm-hmm. So the archaeologist who discovered this site, Klaus Schmidt, he coined the famous phrase, first came the temple, then the city. By that, he means that it was the urge for people to congregate and to perform those rituals. So it was a spiritual urge that brought them together in the first place to build this mega structure. And it was only because this mega structure then necessitated the existence of a permanent priesthood or permanent food supplies to support those pilgrims that permanent settlement arrived after the establishment of the temple. So it's a very provocative hypothesis. And if it's true, and there seem to be similar structures around the world, like Göbekli Tepe, that predate the appearance of permanent settlement, that might mean that everything we thought we knew about the origins of human civilization might be wrong.
If this all is true, couldn't it also shed new light on the ideas people have about the things that hunter-gatherers could build together and the ways they could cooperate, the structures they could build and so on? Because, I mean, we tend to associate these kinds of structures very much with agricultural societies and early civilization. Right.
Yeah, of course, absolutely, and it does that. It does show very strikingly that groups of people, presumably small groups of people initially, who have no access at all to modern technology, not even the wheel, are able to build these mega structures. But that also shows something important about the motivation for doing that, because they, as far as we know, they didn't do this to build shelter. They didn't do this to build irrigation, for example. The first time they did this, they did it in order to perform ritual and in order to worship. So that shows something very important about our priorities as a species.
Mm-hmm. So earlier we talked a little bit about uncertainty and how people come up with ritualized behaviors in contexts of uncertainty and how some rituals develop in those kinds of conditions. We can also talk about anxiety, controlling or reducing anxiety perhaps, but what would you say are the main benefits of rituals, both at the individual and collective levels?
Okay, so let's start at the individual level. And since you mentioned anxiety,
okay,
we already mentioned that in very stressful situations, people engage in more rituals. We see this across various lines of evidence. Ethnographic studies show this. I mentioned our experimental study that shows this. And we have done more work in a series of studies that was led by Martin Lang, a former graduate student of mine, to see whether this connection between ritual and anxiety actually serves a purpose. In other words, we know that in times of stress, people turn to ritual, but does that actually help them reduce anxiety? And to do this, we first conducted a naturalistic study. So we went to a small island in the Indian Ocean, the island of Mauritius. And there we went into a small fishing village, and we observed local women as they would go to the local Marathi Hindu temple and worship. And what they do there is that they perform these prayers. Prayer in that context is mostly about actions. It's not so much about thoughts or utterances. So you go in front of the statues of various deities, and you make these ritual offerings, and you use a censer. So a lot of it is about motions. These repetitive types of motions that we saw people perform when we stretched them up in the lab. And for that study, we had people wear these portable health monitors that were, in this case, they were measuring heart rate variability, which is related to our body's ability to cope with stress. And we compared a group who would go after engaging in a stressful task that had them discuss or write about natural disasters that are very pertinent to that group, so cyclones and floods that are a big threat for that island. And we measure their anxiety. We know that this causes them anxiety. And then we have people either go into the temple and perform their usual prayers, or go into a room that resembles the temple, but it has no religious symbols at all. And we ask them to, in that case, to just sit down and relax. I mean, you would think that just sitting down and relaxing would be more stressful than engaging in all kinds of actions. But in fact, we see that those who go into the temple and perform prayers, they're better able to reduce their anxiety after doing that. And we see this both at the subjective level, so they feel more calm, but we also see it in their bodies. Their heart rate variability is increased. And more recently, we followed up on this study. This is a forthcoming publication from an experiment we just did, again, led by Martin Lang. And there we wanted to see specific components of ritualization. So when we bring people again back into the lab now, and we have them engage in structured actions or utterances, so much like we do with prayers, or much like we do with other kinds of rituals, compared to the same actions, the same number of movements, but in a less structured way, in an unstructured way, we see that helps them reduce anxiety. We do see that this happens, the effects are weaker compared to cultural rituals. And that, of course, is because cultural rituals have all kinds of other things embedded in them. They have beliefs about their efficacy. They have beliefs about supernatural connections. They're connected to tradition. So they're about more than the individual. They're about connecting you to an old sort of society of fellows that extends beyond you and your immediate family, and so on and so forth. But we do see with those studies that different aspects of ritual, which some of them are mechanical, they're related to the actions themselves, and some of them are more symbolic. All of these things converge together to make ritual an effective way to fight anxiety.
So, and what about the collective benefits that we have? For example, when it comes to in-group solidarity and things related to cooperation, is it that rituals boost it?
Yes, absolutely. So this is, again, old anthropological wisdom that rituals serve to increase social cohesion. But for a very long time, there was no direct evidence for this. This came from anthropologists' own intuitions, for the most part. In recent years, there have been empirical studies that actually demonstrate those effects. Mm-hmm. For example, we see that when people get together to perform rituals, their physiological responses are aligned. Their emotional responses are aligned. And ritual is very good at doing this. So by aligning our emotional responses, our physiological responses, by aligning our appearances, whether we wear the same clothes, for example, or the same bodily ornaments and makeup, by aligning our movements and our actions, all of those things independently, but cumulatively, they give us a sense that we are more similar to each other. So if we act more similarly, then we are more similar. So we feel closer to each other. We feel bonded. And we have studies that show this both in natural contexts. So, for example, after the performance of a very painful ritual in Mauritius, we saw that people in that community became more generous towards each other. We have them engaged in some sort of charity task after performing a very painful ritual, or after performing a low-key ritual, a collective prayer, or in the context of no ritual at all. And we see that engaging in rituals makes people more generous in that context, more pro-social, and especially engaging in more painful rituals makes them even more so. And there's a linear relationship between pain and pro-sociality in that context. Now, that is something that ethnographically you can also observe with the naked eye. I mean, you can see the people in that community become more pro-social. You can see how during those big religious festivals, and we're talking about Tamil Hindu festivals in this case, people come out of the streets and they freely share food and water with one another. They help the pilgrims soothe their feet because they're walking on burning hot asphalt. They donate food to the temple, which and in turn then people volunteer there to cook it and donate it to everybody present, and so on and so forth. So all of this is there and can be observed. But with studies like the one I described, we can now find more measurable evidence for this hypothesis.
In rituals, is causal opacity a bug or a feature?
So in my book, I described it as a feature. In fact, we know that our perceptual system makes a distinction between utilitarian actions and other kinds of actions. There are studies, for example, by Rohan Kapitani and his colleagues, that show that when we perceive a non-functional action, or even when a functional action is embedded with a non-functional aspect, with a ritualized aspect, people tend to see it as more special. So in that experiment, people were given a drink in one of two conditions, and in one condition, the serving of the drink was pretty simple, and in the other case, it was very ritualized. So somebody had to pour the drink from up high and then turn it around, and so on and so forth. And people perceived this drink to be better. They perceived it to be more valuable. They thought it would cost more money, and especially when it was connected to some kind of specific tradition, as they were told. We see the same thing in our basketball study that I mentioned, that when those free shots, a very directly utilitarian action in the context of the game, was coupled with ritualized elements, people perceived it to be more efficient. And so causal opacity does signal that kind of special attributes or special value to any kind of action. But another thing it does at the collective level now, causal opacity allows us to differentiate one group from another, because ritual actions are arbitrary actions. They can be done in an infinite number of ways. That means that our group will do our rituals in a specific way, and this way is not very easy for outsiders to learn. It takes practice. And therefore, it's very obvious. I don't know if you've ever been to a religious service of a group that was very different than yours. You probably felt very awkward, because as everybody knew exactly what to do, they knew when to kneel and when to stand and when to chant, you had no idea what to do. And of course, you were very obviously an outsider. And this can be one feature of collective rituals. They're a good way of identified in-group members and outsiders.
Of course, since we're doing an interview on rituals, we can't avoid talking about religion and religious rituals specifically, because these are some of the biggest and most prominent rituals across human societies. And with that in mind, there have been some people that have developed systems to classify religious rituals, like the modes of religiosity theory. What do you think about it? In this case, we're talking about the doctrinal mode and the imagistic mode.
Yeah, this is something I mentioned in my book, and in fact, I was Harvey Whitehouse's doctoral student, so obviously he has had an influence on my own thinking about ritual. And I think he's right about the fact that If you look at all of the kinds of religious rituals around the world, and I do think this extends beyond religious rituals. So perhaps we can come back to this later. But they might seem infinitely variable. But if you look systematically, you will see that there are some patterns. So, for example, Whitehouse and Quentin Atkinson, they did a large survey of ethnographic record. They looked at something like 600 or 700 different ritual traditions, I think. And they found that they tend to cluster around two specific types or poles. One type is highly arousing, highly intense, but infrequently performed rituals. And the other one is low arousal, but high frequency rituals. Now, those two types of rituals, they can feel fundamentally different. So think about going to Mass every week, and then think about performing a fire walking ceremony, or think about your wedding, or think about a funeral. So these are two very different types of rituals, right? And Whitehouse says that these two types of rituals have very different effects psychologically. In the one case, in the case of low arousal, so doctrinal rituals, as he calls them, their effects primarily come through reinforcing this sense of group membership through producing semantic memories. So if you ask somebody who goes to church every week, if you ask them what happened a month ago, they probably won't describe anything specific about that service. They will describe what usually happens. And by doing this again and again and again and again, you get this sense of sort of anonymous, vague membership in this large community of believers, many of whom you've never met. On the other hand, there are what Whitehouse calls as imagistic rituals. Now, those are very intense, very emotionally arousing. Sometimes they can be traumatic. Think of initiation rituals. Think of what happens to a group of warriors as they go into the battlefield together.
Yeah.
So these rituals might mimic those conditions. And those create episodic types of memories. So the way to understand the distinction between semantic and episodic memories, an analogy might help here. Think that you're walking through a field of grass, and if you walk through the field once, then just a few hours later, it will become harder and harder to trace your steps. If you take the same path every day for years, you will create a very well-defined path. Instead, you could also drive a bulldozer through the field just once, and that would create a scar in the middle of the field that might remain there for decades or even longer. So you can create these long-lasting impressions by either one of those two ways. But if you do the semantic way, so if you walk through the field every day, day after day, you will never be able to see the trace of any specific event in that path. All you will see is the cumulative effects, the more general types of memories that we get from participating in those low-key ceremonies. But highly arousing ceremonies, they're very powerful. Just by performing once, they can have equally lasting effects on our memories. But those effects are now felt as distinct episodes. So it's a very concrete event that you have in your mind. And because that event is very traumatic, very emotional, very personally significant and consequential, everybody else who took part in that event with you begins to feel very close to you. So you get a sense of kinship with people who go through these ceremonies together. And it's not an accident that many people in those contexts will call each other their brethren or their family. So they're brothers and sisters and members of the same tight group. More recently, Whitehouse talks about the effects of these rituals in creating phenotypic matching. And this is a term that refers to our ability to recognize kin. Typically, people who are our kin are people who they look like us. So we know that phenotype closely tracks genotype. So people who look more like us are more likely to be more closely related to us. So rituals can do this through, and even low-key rituals can do this through creating these kinds of similarities by similar ways of dressing and behaving and so on and so forth. But another thing that we see happening with our families is that some of the most emotional times of our lives, the times that we cry together and that we laugh together and that we get scared together and we go through horrible things together, even traumatic events, typically those times they are with our closest family members and maybe friends. So rituals manage to create that sense of kinship by putting people through these ordeals in a controlled setting and creating those episodic memories. And as a result, people feel closely bonded. And studies show that those types of experiences increase a sense of identity fusion, which means that their sense of who they are as a person, their very autobiographical narratives, they get blended with their sense of who they are in terms of their group membership. And psychological studies suggest that people who go through these processes together are more willing to defend each other when a member of their team is attacked, because they feel that an offense against another member of the team is an offense against themselves.
Mm-hmm. Does this prosociality, that is the result of high arousal rituals, have long-term effects, or does it only work in the short term?
It definitely does. Like if you ask the members of any military unit who have been through such hardships together, and those hardships can come from initiation rituals themselves, or they can come from going into the battlefield, and those are very similar experiences in a sense. But for example, in my own study, I have found that people who engaged in that painful ritual that I described, which increased prosociality towards other group members, we later had people play an economic game on that island. And we saw how likely they were to cheat when playing against another member of their group. And what we find is that those people who have gone through these rituals more frequently we mean in their lifetime, because these are annual ceremonies, those who have gone through these rituals in the past, they were less likely to cheat. So we see lasting effects of that type of ritual on prosociality. Because those types of rituals, they can signal a lot of things, and they can signal a lot of things to outsiders, but they also signal a lot of things to the self. So if you've been through this painful ritual, if you put a skewer through your cheeks, if you walked across burning embers, in order to signal your group membership, that's a direct signal to your own brain that this is something very important, very meaningful to you.
Could you tell us a bit specifically about fire walking rituals? Because that's something that you really talk a lot about in the book, and I think that's a good example. Perhaps you can get into the methodology about how you can take the lab into the field.
Yes, so I started for my doctoral dissertation. My first long-term fieldwork took place in some small villages in northern Greece, where a handful of communities called the Anastenaria live. And the Anastenaria have these fire walking rituals. Those are groups of Orthodox Christians who practice, they follow the same liturgical cycle of the Greek Orthodox Church, but in addition to that, they have this other set of traditions that revolve around two particular saints, Constantine and Helen. Mm-hmm. And every May, to honor those two saints, there's a big festival, and that involves 3 days of dancing, ecstatic dancing, and how walking across a bed of glowing embers. So this is what I did for my doctoral dissertation. I studied how those rituals shaped people's autobiographical memories and their identities of who they were and how they create meaning for them. But this was work that at the time was pretty much traditional ethnography. So it involved no measurement or other kind of quantification. I brought my own interpretation to what was happening there. And that left me with a feeling that something more was needed. And it left him with a realization that academia is very fragmented. But at the end of the day, we all study the same things. Anthropologists and psychologists, for example, they're interested in the same big questions. What makes us humans? How do people behave under different circumstances? How do we bond? How do we form our different types of identities? But they go about studying those two things in fundamentally different ways. And the reason it happens is not initially, I think it's not a theoretical one. It's a pragmatic one. It's because they're trained to use different methods. So anthropologists are used to conducting ethnographic fieldwork and using interpretation and subjective statements. Psychologists are used to doing things in the lab where they study things in very sterilized, decontextualized ways, but that allows them to have more control of their variables. Mm-hmm. Fundamentally different ways of studying essentially the same thing. But of course, human nature is indivisible. We're both a social, cultural, symbolic species, but we're also a biological, psychological species. We have pan-human predispositions and we have cultural particularities, right? So how do we have our cake and eat it too? And this is not an easy question to answer, but the way I approached it is I thought, instead of taking people out of context and moving them into a lab when they become subjects of our manipulations, why not try to take the lab into the field and moving it into context? This is very important for the kinds of things that I study, for example, because if you're studying firewalking rituals or massive religious pilgrimages or other kinds of collective ceremonies that involve specific contexts and specific symbols and large numbers and particular places and even a lot of pain and suffering, those are things you just cannot replicate in a lab. But what you could do is try to move the lab into the field. So my first attempt at doing this was after completing my research in Greece. I then conducted ethnographic fieldwork in another Mediterranean village, this time in Spain. And this is a village called San Pedro Manrique. And I went there because there too was a firewalking ritual. And this, in fact, is a much more fierce ritual. So we measured the temperature there at close to 800 degrees Celsius, which is over 1200 Fahrenheit. That's enough to melt aluminum. And in that context, people will gather, will take off their shoes. They will take a family member on their back or somebody else close to them and carry them through the fire, walking barefooted. So this is a very striking ritual, to say the least. It's very obvious that it's very important to the life of that community. There are 600 people living there, but 3,000 spectators come every year. And they built this amphitheater that is only used for that particular event, and it's packed every year. So the most important event in the entire area. And in that context, we wanted to test some of the things that we thought were happening, and they were things that were coming both from what my participants were saying, my informants, but also things that anthropologists had surmised for a long time. So when I talked to people, I asked them, why do you do this ritual? Everybody said this is the most important event in their lives. But why do you do it? And when I raised this question, most people just look at me and they say, what do you mean? That's what we do. It's our tradition. That's who we are. And they will leave it at that. But of course, as an anthropologist, sometimes the most important insights you don't get them when you have your notepad, or you don't get them when you're sitting across a table conducting a formal interview. You get them at the bar and at people's homes and in the streets. So as you begin to do that, you see that people do have intuitions about what these rituals do, even if they don't articulate them. So a lot of people would tell me things like, when we get up there and we go through this ritual, there are 3,000 people there, but you feel like one. Or in other contexts, in a Sufi ritual that I studied in Turkey, people specifically said our hearts beat as one during this ritual. And they also talk about what this means in terms of communal bonding. They say the next day you see somebody in the streets and you know you've been through this thing together. And because you've been through this thing together, you have bonded. You have a qualitatively different relationship to that person. Mm-hmm. So in that context, I thought let's turn these insights that people have about how when they go up there, they all feel like one. They have this sense of togetherness and their emotions are aligned. Let's try to measure that. Let's turn this into a testable hypothesis. And to do this, we used heart rate monitors, and we placed those heart rate monitors both on firewalkers themselves, but also members of their families, members of their social circle, and even on outsiders, people who come from as curious spectators towards the event. Yeah. And the first thing we found was that there's this astonishing level of synchrony between people's heart rates, irrespective of what they're doing. So this is not just for those who walk across the coals. Their friends and family and other group members who are watching, they have the same reactions, the same emotional reactions. But that does not hold for the outsiders. And when we mapped the social network of this area, so we asked everybody to tell us who their closest friends and relatives were, we see that social proximity could predict heart rate synchrony. So, and this connects to long-standing anthropological theories. Emil Durkheim described this feeling of collective effervescence. He said when people congregate in large numbers to perform collective rituals, there's this feeling of, he described it as a feeling of electricity, as a jolt of electricity running through them and making them energized. Something like when you're part of a large concert and people are chanting together, or any other kind of large group, and you feel goosebumps at the back of your neck. That's the kind of feeling that Durkheim described. And Durkheim stressed that this does not merely generate emotions out of thin air. Rather, it brings those people who share those emotions into closer communion. And that seems to be exactly what we're finding in this context. In more recent studies, we explored this phenomenon in other contexts, specifically in sports, among sports fans who were watching basketball games at the University of Connecticut. So at UConn, where I am, we have one of the best basketball teams in the history of college sports, the UConn Huskies. So both our men and women's teams, especially the women's teams, are formidable. And we have a very loyal fanship base too. So we thought this was a good context to explore what was happening among those fans and how they form connections with other group members. So we used the same methodology, but now we did it at a much larger scale. So what we did in the firewalking study is now one unit of analysis. We did a similar study at every game throughout the entire season. So we have a number of games, people both watching in the stadium and for the away games, watching them on television in groups. And we look at their heart rate dynamics, and we see that people in the stadium, people who are physically present, their heart rates are more synchronized at the group level. And we see that this thing in turn predicts, first of all, it predicts how meaningful the experience is, how transformational the experience of watching the game is. And that in turn predicts how closely bonded they feel to other group members. So we're seeing that this heart rate synchrony indeed produces those kinds of social emotions that we thought it did. And we looked at, we analyzed those games for over a year. We had people in my lab quantify all kinds of aspects of the game. We measured anything we could measure. We measured the number of interruptions. We measured the fluctuations in score. We measured the number of shots and blocks and slam dunks and timeouts and everything you could imagine. And of course, some of these things play a role for people's experience. So for example, if they're watching a more tight game in terms of its score, they're going to be more aroused compared to watching an easy game, right? But the biggest predictor of both people's experience and their sentiment towards their group was the level to which their heart rates were synchronized with those of other attendants. And now we're doing the same studies. We have done the same studies actually in football stadiums in Brazil, and we're working through the results.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, particularly when it comes to the firewalking rituals, because of course, at least physically, these are very stressful rituals, right? So, I mean, the psychological benefits people get from them, do they come, do you have any idea if they come really from this shared identity they have with the other participants,
Mhm.
or perhaps with them attributing some meaning to that stress they go through?
Yeah, so I tend to look at rituals as social technologies. And the reason these technologies are so successful and have survived for so long is that they're able to tap onto all those different kinds of mechanisms. So all of the things that you said, it's all of these things at the same time. So we've done studies where we look at the effects of highly emotional, even painful, very painful rituals, indeed, on people's well-being and quality of life. And we see that those who go through those very painful rituals. So this is a ritual in Mauritius performed by Tamil Hindus that involves piercing the body with numerous needles and skewers and carrying these very large structures called kavadi on a long pilgrimage that lasts for the better part of a day. And they're doing this barefooted on the burning midsummer tropical uh, sun as it bakes the asphalt. And they go through all kinds of other hardships. They have hooks attached to their skin by which they drag chariots. So this is really self-imposed torture over the course of a day. And when they reach the temple of Murugan, who is the deity, the Hindu deity for whom this is performed, they then have to climb 242 steps, carrying these burdens on their back at the brink of exhaustion in order to offer them to the deity. So in this context, we studied the psychological effects of this context in terms of the people's health and well-being. And we see a number of really interesting things. First of all, we see that individuals who suffer from chronic illness, and especially mental conditions, particularly anxiety disorders, they're more likely to engage in those rituals. And when they do, they do it in more intense forms. So they will put more needles in their body, for example. And then we look at the outcomes of this. And we see that, first of all, we see that this ritual is extremely stressful. But just a couple of days later, we don't see any traces of that stress in their body. But a month later, we see that those who have taken part in those rituals compared to those who didn't, they have increased subjective well-being and quality of life. And this is increased as a function of suffering itself. So the more needles they put in their bodies, or the more stress they experience, and we measure that stress in terms of their electrodermal activity, the more pronounced these effects are. Now, how does this happen? And this goes to your question. I think it's a combination of rituals' ability to help individuals soothe anxiety because of the predictability and the structure that they involve. A combination of that coupled with a specific set of beliefs and expectations. So a lot of people are engaged in those rituals because they're seeking health benefits. And very importantly, they also involve direct neurophysiological stimulation. So we know that people who suffer from anxiety disorders, things like physical exercise, they're very important to them. Except if you're depressed, of course, the last thing you want to do is go out and exercise. So these rituals sort of provide external incentives to do this kind of thing. And perhaps most important of all, these rituals create social support networks. We've examined the social effects of those rituals in multiple studies. We know that those who go through these painful ceremonies, they create larger social networks. They make friends. Their status within that community increases. They're more likely to socialize with other group members after that, and so on and so forth. So it's through this combination of all of those different, very different level mechanisms that these rituals provide these benefits that sometimes can seem surprising.
So, I mean, this is perhaps an aside question, but still, I think it's interesting to ask. So, I mean, I guess that for you who study rituals, perhaps you have a different perspective on this than many people who live, particularly in industrialized and post-industrial societies, who do not go through these more painful rituals have of them, because I would imagine that medically speaking, it would be ill-advised, let's say, for people to walk on burning coal or to pierce
Yes.
their bodies, but it still might be the case that the benefits, both individual and social, that they get from these outweigh the physical costs, right?
It could be, yes. But it's also important to stress that these rituals make more sense when they're performed in a context that makes sense. So if it's part of your tradition, then
Sure.
then it comes much more naturally to do this. But I should also say that even in industrialized and post-industrialized societies, there are many more of these rituals than we realize. So perhaps people don't find this sense of connection and well-being in traditional religious rituals in those societies, but they might find them just as well in contexts like sports stadiums, in contexts like rave parties and rock concerts, in contexts like Burning Man. And in those contexts, you see that there's some very high intensity rituals performed. I was once talking to a friend who was telling me how when she was doing her fieldwork in a small village in Brazil, sometimes she would visit the city and just go and dance like there was no tomorrow. And she drew a parallel between what the people in the village were doing that she was studying, who were engaged in those traditional rituals that involve trance and other forms of ecstasy, and they would see them as healing rituals. Of course, she wouldn't participate in those because it was not her place. She was an outsider. But she would go to the city and she would dance all night with a group of friends. And she said this is what kept her sane through that process, because she was going through all kinds of things. But that for her played the same role as those traditional rituals played for those people that she was studying. So people find ritual in all kinds of settings. Sometimes we don't see it because it's right in front of our eyes. It's more obvious when it's something exotic, when it's performed by a tribe in the Amazon. Yeah. But all of those things too, the things that happen in sports stadiums, the things that happen at college graduations, the things that happen at rock concerts, those too are the same kinds of collective rituals, and they play the same kinds of roles in our lives.
Mm-hmm. But are there any particular contexts where these more costly rituals tend to develop or not?
So historically, there are studies, for example, that show that societies that face higher external threat, they tend to have more painful initiation ceremonies. Now, in that refers to traditional societies, of course. That was a survey of the ethnographic record. In our societies too, we definitely see, even if it's not the painful kind of ceremonies, we see that the types of rituals that you see in the political sphere, those collective rituals that sometimes can involve a lot of outrage and negative emotions towards outsiders, you see that those tend to rise whenever populist leaders invoke an external threat. So traditionally, this could have been, for example, the Jews. If you look at Nazi parades and rallies, this is such a ritualized context. And those people who took part in those rallies and chanted in synchrony, they would have felt the same kind of collective effervescence than people today feel in a sports stadium. So, and this is why I always say that ritual is a technology, and as any technology, it can be used for better and for worse.
Yeah. One specific aspect that I don't think we have touched on yet is can people who put themselves through these rituals, I mean, can these rituals also serve as a form of credibility enhancing display?
Yes, of course. This is a term that comes from the anthropologist Joseph Heinrich at Harvard. Heinrich says that these rituals, this goes back to a more general perspective of ritual as a communicative device. So from the CRED perspective, CRED standing from credibility enhancing displays, watching other people perform those highly intense rituals in the context of group membership, of a group tradition, is a signal to both insiders and outsiders that is a meaningful tradition. So if I see somebody walk on fire in order to join a group, that immediately tells me that that's a group worth joining. And Heinrich would argue that rituals that do send out, or traditions, religious traditions that do send out those credibility enhancing, those signals, those CREDs, they will be far more likely to survive and be adopted. And in fact, this applies to all kinds of other things. There was a study of that looked at solar panel adoption, and what they found was that it was when political leaders themselves actually installed solar panels on their roofs that people in that state will also adopt them. So if I take part in a religious ceremony where nobody goes to great lengths to worship, then why should I think that this is meaningful at all? But if I join that group where I've seen that people pierced their body or walked on fire in order to join, that's a signal for me that people care about that group because that group is important.
Mm-hmm. Another question, is there any relationship between performing these rituals and sexual selection? Is it, for example, that by participating in these rituals, at least sometimes people might also have the chance to signal something about their mate value?
That's an excellent question. And this is, in fact, a question that has been really overlooked in the study of ritual, at least from an empirical perspective. And I think that rituals, that there is a selection process happening both at the genetic and at the cultural level. Mm. What I mean by this is that there are certain rituals among some human groups, for example, the Maasai in parts of Africa, who have these rituals where the young boys will jump as high as they can. They're equivalent rituals performed by girls, let's say in Swazi tribes, for example, in other parts of Africa, where they have these rituals where there's a high kick, which is a move where your foot goes way over their head as you're dancing, which is a very difficult move to perform. I think in a Western context, only professional dancers would be fit enough to do this. And in both these kinds of rituals, members of the opposite sex will pick their partners in the context of that ritual. So people gather around, they comment on the appearance and the performance of each dancer. So it's a contest of sorts, and then they pick the one they want to date or marry. So here we have something that is directly equivalent to some of the rituals that we see among birds, for example. This is very clearly a mating ritual, and this can have, if it's done for generations and generations, obviously can have an impact on genetic fitness, because those who are better fit are going to be selected and are going to procreate more. There's another sense in which rituals can be selected in similar ways. For example, we did a study in Mauritius where we created dating profiles. We did a photo shoot with local Tamil men, and we manipulated those profiles to signal through the background picture that this individual either had taken part in a very painful ritual, or had taken part in regular temple worship, or had not taken part in any rituals. And then we showed these profiles to young unmarried women in that area, as well as parents of unmarried girls. And the reason we did this is that traditionally marriage has been a tool for strategic alliance building. So for the majority of our history as a species, it was the family who decided, and if not outright dictated partners to their children, they at least vetted them or vetoed them or consulted or advised or imposed mates upon their children. And this is something that in many contexts still happens. Matchmaking through the family is still the most common way of getting married around the world in most human societies. So we showed these different dating profiles, and we asked both the girls and their parents to identify the better matches, either for going out on a date or somebody who would be a potential husband. And we saw that both those ritual conditions, they were seen as more desirable mates. The other thing we see is that the girls did not really have any preference. If anything, they seem to slightly prefer the low intensity ritual to the high intensity one. But for the parents, it seems that the more the better. And this discrepancy itself is very interesting here, because this is a culture where you have a patrilocal system, and that means that when a girl is married, she will leave her family and go live with the husband's family. So she will lose all her social support network and have to build another one from scratch. So perhaps in that context, for the girls, although they still value the importance of ritual, they didn't want overly conservative husbands, because presumably that's my interpretation. Presumably, they were worried that their place in that kind of conservative household would be more difficult as women in a patriarchal society. For the parents, on the other hand, it seems that creating bonds with people who take part in those high intensity rituals was seen more desirable. Perhaps because that would, a marriage is an arrangement not just between two individuals, but between two families. And because we know that taking part in those rituals is a way to increase your status, having new family members who take part in those rituals would presumably also increase the family's status. So here we have two different mechanisms. One is through genetic selection, which historically certainly would have been a way for our ancestors to advertise their fitness. Mm-hmm. And for that matter, it still happens today in every dance floor in the world. Dance floors are clearly our own lex or mating arenas, and a lot of mating certainly happens in that context. And that's one avenue, and the other avenue is through the cultural selection, which is the pressure on these ritual forms to be sustained in ways that help family members discern commitment to the group and therefore pick the better mates.
Mm-hmm. So in certain rituals, people also use drugs. In those specific cases, what is the role played by drugs? I mean, what aspects of human psychology, for example, do they play a role in?
So intoxicants have been very commonly used in a lot of rituals, especially shamanic types of rituals, those that involve trance and ecstasy and states of dissociation. So these drugs might be used to create a sense of disembodiment or sort of an other out-of-body experience through dissociation, or to produce hallucinations, which can then be connected to the divine and strengthen the religious ideology and expectations that frame this ritual. For me, one of the most interesting things to note here is that the same effects that can induce pharmacologically can also, in many contexts, induce physiologically. And what I mean by that is that in the rituals that I've studied, none of them involve the use of drugs. In fact, even alcohol consumption is banned throughout these festivals. It's seen as taboo. People fast, but phenomenologically, so from the point of view of people's subjective experience, we see that you can get the exact, at least seemingly, you can get the exact same experience through manipulating your body, not directly manipulating your brain chemistry, which is a more direct way of doing it, I guess. But through engaging in things like sensory deprivation, fasting, prolonged exhaustion. So in some of the contexts that I studied, and some of the fireworking rituals that I studied, in Greece, for example, there was this woman who told me, in that context, she was dancing for 3 days. And sometimes you see people dance, so they take breaks to eat, of course, and they go to sleep, and then the next day they continue. But sometimes they dance to the point of collapsing. They fall, they faint on the floor, and then somebody will lift them up, and after they regain their senses, they keep dancing again and again. And this is in a small room that is very hot and stuffy and full of the smoke of incense, which is perhaps a little bit of a pharmacological intervention here. and the sounds are there, and you're sweating and you're dehydrated, and there's sensory hyperstimulation. And at the end of those 3 days, she described to me how she looked up and she saw that the ceiling had been lifted and angels were dancing and singing around her. And I've heard many accounts of that sort. So the same kinds of effects that you could get from these drugs, sometimes you can get by manipulating the body. And rituals are very good at doing this.
Mm-hmm. So I have one last question that is more of a general one, not necessarily related to rituals directly. Earlier we talked about natural experiments and lab experiments and how you can sometimes combine both of them, at least to some extent, and the relationship between different social sciences like anthropology and psychology. What would you say are the benefits and obstacles to an interdisciplinary approach in the social sciences?
The benefits to somebody like me are pretty obvious. As I said, human nature is one and indivisible, and if we only study human nature through a particular lens, we're always going to miss all of these other aspects. And disciplines are, of course, necessary. We're way beyond the point where one scholar could know everything there is to know. We need specialization, and specialization typically for most disciplines happens in terms of the methods we use, which means that we're given a hammer, and when you have a hammer, you see everything like a nail. Mm-hmm. Everything looks like a nail to you. So then you come across a screw, and you don't know what to do with it. And I think that's the point of an interdisciplinary perspective. We should be driven by our questions, not by our methods. That's the most important thing for me. And in academia, you often have people who are asking the same question, but because they never collaborate, they never even talk to each other. Each one of them applies whatever method they've been pre-trained to apply to everything. And most of the time, by definition, this will be the wrong method. Now, you also asked me how to fix this, what to do.
Yeah, and specifically, what do you think are the major obstacles there?
Oh, right. So, well, the obstacles are institutional, they're political. We are all, science is a human endeavor, and of course there are all kinds of considerations. If you're a psychologist who competes for a particular type of grants, you have to tailor your methods to fit that granting agency. If you're an anthropologist, you have to do the same. The way we train our students, graduate students in anthropology are expected to go into the field and spend 2 years very carefully observing one particular society and coming back and writing a monograph. And if you want to get a job, you have to publish that monograph. Psychology students are sometimes they're trained to conduct a series of experiments in the lab, and by the time you get your PhD, you're supposed to have a number of publications out. So this pushes you towards a particular methodology. This pushes you towards a particular time frame. A psychology student does not have time to go out and spend 2 years in the field. An anthropology student does not have adequate training to bring measurement into their work. How to overcome this? It's not easy, but I think I have been very lucky to have been trained and then later worked in interdisciplinary centers. And I know that my best work has always happened in those contexts. So I think disciplines are very important, but I think universities need to establish interdisciplinary structures where people come together, spend time, interact on the basis of ideas, not on the basis of methods. So they identify common problems, and then they set out to find the best ways of solving those problems. And by necessity, this is something that has to come through teamwork and collaboration. If you look at my publications, most of them have 8 or 10 authors. So this is necessary. You have to bring in different kinds of expertise, and I think that's the way research is headed. We have way more co-authored papers and collaborative projects now than you did just a few decades ago. And that's the way I think all science should be conducted.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Xygalatas, Would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet just before we go?
Yeah, so my latest book, it's called Ritual, How Seemingly Senseless Acts Make Life Worth Living. You can get this on Amazon or any major bookstore.
Yeah.
And you can also check out my website. All of my articles and other publications are accessible through that website.
Great. So I will be leaving the link to the book in the description box of the interview and to your work in general. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show and for writing the book, which was a great read for me at least. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's been a real pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett Perga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Ian Ricalania, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodren, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Haslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T., Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Antonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luis Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.